In this video, we'll be looking at Carlson from Of Mice and Men. Many of you have requested this video specifically in preparation for the upcoming English Literature exam. And I have had a number of you question whether it's likely Carlson will come up as a character question. The answer is we really don't know. But it's not a definite no. He is a minor character, but that doesn't mean you can't get a question on Carlson specifically. I would argue there is still enough material on Carlson to be able to answer a full question on him. If he doesn't come up, he's a useful character anyway, linked to a number of themes: violence, masculinity, human nature. So he's a really important character anyway in terms of referencing him for other topics that might come up. So first of all, I think he's mostly known or considered to be a cruel character, and we see that mostly when he is pretty adamant that the old sheepdog, Candy's dog, should be killed. We see this in a quote, and there's a number of quotes like this. Why don't you get Candy to shoot his old dog and give him one of the pups to raise up? So that's him speaking to Slim. Remember, Slim has some new puppies, and basically Carlson is suggesting that we replace the old sheepdog with a brand new puppy. So here he's being really dismissive and heartless. He's clearly incapable of understanding the emotional attachment Candy has with his dog. And so what we at least see is that he is void of sentiment. And he can't really grasp why this old sheepdog might be something special to Candy, and why it might be difficult for Candy to let go. We also see this, however, so we're talking about a dog, maybe you can understand that, but we also see this right at the end of the novella, just after Lenny has been killed by George, and he notices that George and Slim seem very sad. And what does he say? It's the last bit of dialogue right at the end of the novella. Now, what the hell you suppose is eating them two guys? So he doesn't understand why they would be sad. So, okay, it's one thing not understanding the emotional connection between Candy and his dog, but the fact that he's unable to comprehend the sadness of George and Slim over the death of Lenny is really quite terrifying. It reveals a complete emotional detachment to others and a complete disregard for human life, regardless of what that human life has done. Obviously, Lenny has just killed Curly's wife, but still there's something uncomfortable about Carlson as a character in how heartless he seems. So how do we link this to context? Remember, if you're doing Edexcel IGCSE, then this is worth half the marks of the question. So you must link to context and do so in detail. So you have to ask yourself really, and there's no right answer, what is Steinbeck using Carlson as a character for? Is he suggesting that it is in our very nature to be cruel? Or is he saying that it's the world in which we live in that can breed such savagery? So as an example, in such desperate times of the 1930s, as we know, it's mass unemployment, it's a really difficult time for the vast majority of people to live in. You might argue people could only afford to focus on one thing, and that is to survive. They didn't have the privilege to be sentimental, and that's why we see someone like Carlson. So is it the world in which Carlson lives that has made him so callous, or is it in his very nature? So if you've got a question on human nature, Carlson's a great one to use to explore that idea. His dismissiveness of the old sheepdog mirrors the way the weakest were viewed in society at the time. So, it might seem cruel, but you might argue that the government in the 1930s was cruel. It was dismissive of the weakest and most vulnerable people in society. So a parallel to the old sheepdog being replaced by a younger pup would be Candy, who will soon be replaced by someone younger, fitter and stronger than him. So this was happening in 1930s society. It's not just Carlson as an individual. Now this is worth noting. Keep in mind that Steinbeck is a really intentional writer, especially in Of Mice and Men, and you might argue that not even one sentence is wasted in this novella. Everything is packed with meaning. And one thing you may or may not have noticed is the fact that we know that Carlson has a pistol, but it's repeatedly referred to, and not just the fact that he's got a pistol, but I don't know if it's classed as the model of the pistol or the brand of pistol. I'm definitely not an expert in pistols, but it's referred to as a Luger pistol. So why might Steinbeck draw our attention to the fact that Carlson owns a Luger pistol? So I've looked into this, and this is one way of interpreting that, because like I said, Steinbeck doesn't typically just write things in his novellas for the sake of it. It normally holds some sort of meaning. So the Luger pistol, you might argue, is an allusion to World War I and Nazi Germany, because it's a German-made pistol and it was the weapon of choice for the German army, both in World War I and World War II. But this novella was written in 1937, so Steinbeck wouldn't have known about World War II at this point, although he might have anticipated it at that time. So this might suggest that Carlson was a World War I veteran at first off, okay? Because why else? How else could he have got his hands on a Luger pistol? And that might explain his lack of empathy regarding the loss of life, because he's seen much worse on a much larger scale if he's been involved in the First World War. Is it also Steinbeck alluding to the atrocities taking place in Nazi Germany at the time of writing this novella? So that would be 1937. We're only 2 years away from the outbreak of World War II. And remember, Nazi Germany is a regime that used or is based on the theory of social Darwinism to justify the murder of millions of innocent lives. So does this pistol serve as a reminder that the cruelty we see in Carlson is just one small individual example of the savagery seen on a much larger scale throughout human history, and one of those examples being, if you look at the Nazi regime in Germany? He is a very practical character. So if you look at his justification for killing the old sheepdog, he says, "You ain't being kind to him, keeping him alive." So he's advocating here actually for the concept of euthanasia, otherwise known as mercy killing. And so you might argue that his intentions aren't actually as cruel as they initially seem, but he's actually more concerned with the impracticality of keeping the dog alive. I'd be careful. I wouldn't go as far as to say he's actually concerned for the dog and its well-being. Even though he's saying that, I think what he's really doing here is justifying it and trying to manipulate Candy into agreeing to the old sheepdog being killed. Because just as a reminder, after he kills the old sheepdog, he sits right opposite Candy and cleans the gun in front of him. So I wouldn't say that he's sensitive really to the needs of the dog. And we've heard him talk about what an annoyance this dog is to him. It's got fleas, it stinks. So I don't know if he really cares about whether this is kind to the dog or not. But I will say, I don't think he is ruled by a desire to inflict pain. It's just something, this dog is impractical. This dog isn't useful to him, and therefore we should kill it. It does draw parallels as well to Slim's actions in drowning the puppies. Okay, remember he had a number of puppies, he drowns some of them to allow the stronger or the bigger ones to live. So this, I wouldn't overstate how evil Carlson is, because actually we see this behaviour in Slim, who is considered a moral character. And then think about the way he says he would carry out this mercy killing. If you was to take him out and shoot him right in the back of the head, he'd never know what hit him. So this is another example where Carlson is not motivated by a sadistic desire to just cause pain. It's coming more from a place of practicality. His method of execution is merciful, and it draws parallels with the execution of Lenny at the end of the novella. So again, I wouldn't overstate his character as being evil and loving violence or anything like that. I think it comes more from a pragmatic stance. I don't think there's any sentiment to it, though. I don't think he really cares about being kind to the dog. You can link this to social Darwinism, which gained popularity among the political, medical and economic elite of the United States in the 20s and 30s. This left no room for compassion. It was almost seen like the struggles of the weakest were considered to be natural. That's the way life goes. That's the natural order of things. There are going to be people in society who are weaker, and they're just going to have to struggle and eventually die out. You might also, rather than just looking at social Darwinism, consider that, again, we've already mentioned this, these are desperate times. No one can afford to be anything but practical. And again, you can link this to George killing Lenny at the end. It was actually, in some ways, a practical decision, because Lenny staying alive would have caused lots of issues. One, Lenny would have been in a lot of pain because he would have been attacked by this manhunt, but it was in some respects a pragmatic thing. Of course, it was a moral decision as well, because he didn't want Lenny to suffer. You can argue that he's respected. I've read quite a few analyses of Carlson, and he's always referred to or described in a similar way to Wit, and I disagree with that. I think he has a bit more respect than Wit. He is listened to, and he does stand up for himself. So, for instance, when he does recommend that the old sheepdog should be killed, Slim agrees with him. Cole's right, Candy. So he is listened to by other members of the ranch. Even Slim, and remember, we're encouraged to like Slim and to respect him, agrees with Carlson. But I do think it's important to note that the killing of Candy's dog wouldn't have happened if Slim had disagreed. So there is a clear hierarchy, and Slim certainly is at the top of that pecking order. So I wouldn't overstate how powerful he is, but I definitely think he has some level of respect. And then look at the way that he argues with Curly. I'll kick your goddamn head off. So if I recall correctly, this is when Curly has just accused Slim basically of potentially messing around with Curly, with his wife, and there's all those arguments taking place in the ranch, and Carlson basically tells him it's his fault, he needs to control his wife. Curly tells him to step outside, and instead of carrying away, he stands up actually and says, "I'll kick your goddamn head off." So here what he's doing is he's meeting violence with violence in order to maintain his dominance over Curly in this instance. Now, again, don't overstate this, because he certainly isn't more powerful than Curly. He's a ranch worker at the end of the day, and Curly could get him fired. But also note how Carlson contrasts with Slim in how he deals with conflict, or how he deals with Curly. So his way of I guess, controlling the situation is to throw a threat back at Curly and say he's going to kick his head off. Whereas if you look at Slim and the way that he manipulates Curly, Slim is a much more intelligent character in that sense. So if you recall, Slim ends up saying, "Look, I know your reputation is important to you. I don't think you're going to say what really happened to your hand. You're going to say you got it crushed in a machine." So Slim doesn't choose violence. He's actually much smarter. He's got much more intuitive as well of what's important to Curly and how to manipulate him. So just an interesting contrast there. But you might want to link this to the fact that this ranch really represents the patriarchal society at the time, when we're talking about 1930s America. So, there are clear, rigid expectations of what it was to be a man. Violence was considered a masculine trait, and so these threats of violence, you might argue, are a way of asserting one's masculinity, and that's exactly what Carlson is doing in this instance. He's also misogynistic by saying to Curly, why don't you tell her to stay the hell at home where she belongs? And so what he's doing there is actually placing the blame on Curly for not being able to control his wife. And that really mirrors the sentiment held by many of married women, that first of all, their place was at home and they should be completely obedient to their husbands. And because women were considered the weaker sex at the time, if you couldn't control your wife, it was seen as a weakness of the husband. This is a failure of Curly's part in the eyes of Carlson. So what could be the overall message? Remember, Steinbeck uses all his characters to deliver a message, and also this kind of helps you think about other ways that Carlson can be referenced if he doesn't come up specifically as a question, but maybe you want to link him into a theme-based question. So if you get a question about humankind, he's a great example of that cruelty. Also, he certainly holds the same ideology as social Darwinism, this idea of, it's the strongest survive and the weakest need to just kind of die out. Could there be an argument about how hard life is and how it breeds cruelty? So is it really, so this is kind of goes against this argument that humankind is cruel, and could there be an argument that actually it's not that we are inherently cruel, it's the world that we live in that breeds that cruelty? And of course you can link that to kind of all the terrible hardships of 1930s America. And of course you could even link that to World War I, assuming he is a veteran. And of course this could also be a warning about toxic masculinity, and link that to Slim and how Steinbeck really reveres Slim. He's like the perfect man in Steinbeck's eyes, and the way that Slim is presented as this perfect male who is kind, who is sensitive, he's authoritative, but he doesn't have to rely on violence, in contrast to Carlson, who might be practical like Slim, but also lacks that sentiment and lacks that emotional attachment that Slim seems to have. So those are some ideas. Please feel free to share what you think as well. There's not a huge amount on Carlson, so it'd be interesting to see if anyone derived any other ideas about this character.